guy, but do go, and it's on, I know it's on GBN for sure, that you can go and watch it. Go and watch that debate and see a fellow who's drowning in error and how he responds to it. It is sad in actuality. And the thing about it is that there is a parallel that's running throughout the world presently in regards to the rejection of absolute truth. And we just simply saw it on public display down at Faulkner University today, but you can see it in Washington, D.C., or Portland, Oregon, or Chattanooga, Tennessee. You might even see it in Dunlap, Tennessee, if you look real close, because people absolutely despise the concept of something being absolutely, undeniably right and other things being absolutely, undeniably wrong. They simply do not want that to be the case. And so they do everything within their power to destroy the concept of absolute truth. And they will try to make a distinction between what we all agree to be absolute truth when it comes to subjects like math and science and trigonometry and algebra. But when you're talking about spiritual truth or religious truth, then it takes on a whole other meaning. No, it don't. It don't. Just by saying that doesn't make it so. Truth, in whatever area it is being found, always runs in parallel lines with other truth. And if you have a crossing of lines, then you've got less than the truth. Just the way it is. You're going to have geographical truth and geometric truth and every other truth, but they're all truths that run along parallel lines. You don't have contradictions. And so the very notion that this fellow would claim a lack of acceptance of an objective standard, and yet he turns right around and says, but I believe in objective truth. Well, make up your mind, you know. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. And hopefully you're as shocked as I was at the feeble attempt that he was engaged in. And one of the things that came up and that falls right in line here with what we're studying here at the end of chapter 14 and the first chapter 15 is interpersonal relationships and how you deal in matters like that. One of the points that was made, the guy that was debating, he said, why is it that the Jews don't accept Jesus to be the Messiah? By the very fact that the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah proves that he's not the Messiah. Now, what's wrong with that reasoning? Is there anything wrong with it? Does that make sense? It don't make a lick of sense. Number one, who do you think the first Christians were? They were Jews. So to say the Jews didn't accept Jesus as Messiah is just a bald-faced lie. It's not true. It's not accurate. Now, I don't know whether this guy who's written all these books and got doctorate degrees and teaches on college, I don't know whether he's just uninformed or what, but he's just lying. And then to say that who knows Hebrew better than a Hebrew? And so if Jesus really was the promised Messiah, then you know for sure that those who knew the Hebrew language the best would have accepted him as the Messiah. So are we to believe that if people who are at least looked upon by the world as being experts, they have the right to determine what absolute truth is just because of how expert they are in the Bible language? What else do we depend on somebody like that to tell us the whole points of objectivity? Well, it doesn't exist. And his whole point comes down to this. Truth is established by people establishing. In other words, we're dependent upon individuals to substantiate the truth as the truth. In other words, the truth does not exist outside of us going along with it or acknowledging it to be the case. It's dependent upon mankind in order to be actually true. Well, that's just backwards. If nobody in the whole wide world believes the truth, it doesn't change the truth one bit. Doesn't change it at all. If everybody rejects it, it's still the truth. And we understand that in every area of life except when it comes to this most important area, then we just sort of kick the whole concept down the road as if it doesn't apply in regards to our spiritual condition. Well, that simply should not be the case at all.
Well, people have deluded themselves nowadays so that they only believe science.
Exactly.
Male and female.
Exactly. You know, when a woman answering questions from senators fixing to be a Supreme Court justice refuses to answer the question, what is a woman, then that tells you how far removed we are from common sense and objective truth. That's ridiculous. And her explanation, well, I'm not a biologist, and you're not a very smart woman either, obviously. So what are you doing being on the Supreme Court? Now, that's how ludicrous thing. I am confident, though, that people in some areas are finally waking up a little bit to see just how ridiculous and foolish this whole mess is. It's just almost unbearable. You know, here's something I was thinking about too, based on what I observed during that debate. And by all means, please go and listen to that debate. It's not enjoyable when he's talking, but just realize that anything he says that seems to have some credence, Kyle answers it and squashes it just like a fly ought to be smashed. And he does that repeatedly. But he's just not an honest person. Just sad. And he demonstrates that over and over and over again. But when it comes to the matter of objective truth, and I don't know this. I mean, I'm asking if you know. Do you think that in the denominational seminaries of the world, do you think they have a class that they teach denominational doctrines? Do you think denominational churches in their preacher training schools and in their college, do you think they study a topic, denominational doctrine? You think they do? Now, when it comes to world religions, I can see them doing that. But I have great difficulty of seeing how that individuals who believe that there's no difference really in the spiritual status of an individual that's a denominationalist in any of them, that they're all in the same state of being saved, and so those differences, according to that mentality, don't matter. Yeah, oh, absolutely, there's a lot that don't believe it. Yeah, yeah. And that's the thing, and the point being there is the reason why I think that we took denominational doctrines when I was in school and all, is because we know that it's not enough just to be religious. It's not enough just to claim to be a Christian. The Bible has specific parameters on what a Christian is and what an individual must do in order to be a Christian. And then it specifically says how a person, after he's saved, becomes a member of the Lord's church. And it's not by voting. It takes place when a person obeys the gospel, the Lord adds him to his church. Now, since that's what the Bible teaches, then anybody and everybody that doesn't believe that and doesn't do that, they're in jeopardy of being lost forever. And if I'm concerned with souls and the truth that'll set them free, then I can't sit on that information. Therefore, I've told you before, at Tennessee Bible College, I took 4 different correspondence courses. One of them was a Free Will Baptist. One of them was the Knights of Columbus, which I had no idea at the time, but that was a Catholic outfit. I took the Bible course from the Church of the Nazarene, and I can't remember what the other one was. Oh, Seventh-day Adventist. Amazing Facts, okay? And so here's all these different groups that don't teach the same thing as each other, obviously, and don't teach what the Bible teaches. And so what am I doing taking those classes? So I can learn to the best of my ability what they're supposed to be believing if they claim to be a part of this religious group, so that I can help them to see where that misses the mark in regards to what the Bible teaches. That's why we do that. That's why. But if you don't think there's any difference, if you are under the mistaken notion, get saved and join the church of your choice, then you're not going to really be that concerned about what somebody else is teaching, because it doesn't have anything to do with your salvation. That's what you erroneously believe.
I think these guys that are in
Associations.
Associations, yeah. They sit around and play, I've never been, never sit in on one, but in my mind, I think they probably sit around and pretend to, go along with it, but a lot of people in the seats where they're preaching, no, there'll be, there's a lot of, this is my feeling, I don't know, and it might well be wrong, because I'm wrong about a lot of things from time to time, you know that. But I think, people in the seats don't take that line. They heard what, you've heard the term hardship man.
Yeah, yeah.
Hardship man, I guarantee they would believe something for seven head.
Sure, sure.
Or a Jehovah's Witness, or any other mainline like Methodist, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think you would.
Yeah.
Agree to disagree.
Yeah, the agreeing to disagree. And then the final analysis, because there is no acceptance of absolute truth, then how could we really argue over something that's so fundamental as the difference between being lost and being saved? God would not allow that to happen, when in reality, our allegiance to the truth is demonstrated in how we respond to the possibility, hey, I may have been deceived here and believing something's not true. And the thing is, what this fellow kept saying today, and he said it from the standpoint of maybe trying to cover himself a little bit. He said, no, I'm not saying. He said, I'm not saying I know that God doesn't exist. I'm not saying that. He just said, I'm saying that I have not seen enough evidence that he exists. And so ours is out, see? If God was a little bit more lenient with information, if he would just give a little bit more evidence, then he, and so and even Kyle at that point said, by that statement he makes there, if he's honest, then maybe he's just not been exposed to the truth and the facts that are there that prove that the Bible is the Word of God. Maybe here's a candidate to one day becoming a Christian. And you have to think that. You have to believe that. But then at the same time, he goes on to say, there's probably not any amount of evidence that could ever be come up with that's going to lead me to draw a different conclusion than I have. Well, why don't you just go ahead and say you're willing to be wrong in order to save face? That's what you're doing. You're willing to jeopardize your soul eternity just to say, buddy, I didn't bend, but I didn't break one bit. And there's a difference between being stubborn and being right, The problem is when people are stubborn and dig their heels in when they're wrong. There's no great benefit in being in that position, obviously. And if you are right, then you better not say I'm wrong. You better not apologize for being right. That's crazy too.
Freddie, think about the Pharisees, time and again, they saw miracles that were undeniable. And then the raising of Lazarus from the dead, there were those who believed after they saw that. Others of the Jews went to the Pharisees and said, basically, you've got big trouble. He's raised the dead in a way that you can't deny it.
Exactly.
And so what did they try to do? Instead of believing themselves, they later plotted to kill Lazarus so they could remove the evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
That's prejudice gone to seed.
I mean,
So even if this fellow said, if I saw a miracle, maybe that would make, a difference. It won't if the heart is not open.
and that's exactly it.
It did in the New Testament.
No. And we oftentimes, we have to remember that there's that rich man in Luke chapter 16. He says, if my brother just saw somebody that went to him from the dead, well, Lazarus already had. And of course, Abraham says, no, if they won't pay attention to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to pay attention to one if he rose from the dead. If I just...
The power of the word.
Exactly.
That's what he was affirming.
The irony of the fact that he's sitting there having a debate saying that there's no proof of God.
Yeah.
What animal is having a debate, right?
Exactly.
Having a debate. Monkeys aren't sitting there having a debate. So the fact that he's debating the existence of God really honestly proves the existence of God.
Yeah, so, or why would this, and the thing he would keep squirreling away into squirreling himself away into the possibility, that, 99.99. And he even went so far as to say that when it came to UFOs, that he even had written, and Kyle brought this to his attention, he had written that he was 99.99% sure there was no such thing as UFOs. But he wouldn't even say that about the existence of God. And so according to him, he believes there's more evidence for UFOs than there is for God. Now think about that.
Yeah. Tell me again what he said about a miracle. You saw a miracle or what?
No, he just said he had not seen any evidence, sufficient evidence that would lead him to conclude that there's a God. And
Did he hit it what he would need to say?
well, something like a miracle that's recorded in the Bible.
How do you go decide whether that's a miracle or whether it's good with you?
I know it's
That makes it real.
and get beat it all. Guess where he's got a degree from? Pepperdine. 40 years ago, he went to Pepperdine. So it's pitiful. Yeah.
Freddie, I think that same example can also highlight the flip side to, when there, sometimes I think we can put so much energy and emphasis to getting the teaching, the logic, the facts across to someone. When that person, it's not a matter of logic and facts. They're going to reject all the facts and the logic. But that same person might be persuaded by witnessing a faithful congregation of God's people, by having friendships and relationship with people who love their enemies and who love their brothers in a way that they can't explain in any other way than to finally recognize there's something about this Jesus fellow that does something to that person's life.
Yeah. Yeah.
It may not be a factor in argument. It might be a long,
Yeah.
long time of seeing faith.
A faithful observance of faithful bread. Just like the example in 1 Peter chapter 3 of this wife who by the godly conduct of her, she's able to convert her husband without the word, without nagging, but by the life that she lives, she's able to influence it. Now, ultimately, he's going to have to develop faith in what he sees demonstrated by her all the time. It's got to be his own personal faith. It can't be just, well, she's such a good woman, then I'm going to follow her example. Why is she a good woman? And how did you determine what's your definition of a good woman? Now, again, you've got to have some type of objective standard to even determine that. She don't nag. That puts her in, I don't know the percentage of that, what that would be. Would not dare even guess. But nonetheless, it's the influence of her. And then, and the thing is, and I've said this hundreds of times, especially when we had our Ask the Preacher radio program, you can prove something to be true undeniably. But that does not mean everybody's going to accept the undeniable truth that's been proven. That's not what it has to, it's got to be something else, But at some point in time, there has to be the intellectual admittance that that you could not accept, even though it was logical and reasonable. Something's got to get you to the point where you accept it as the truth. Now, like Daniel said, through the softening of the attitude of the individual by the demonstration of the Christian life, and even like Kyle did today when he was, they were both saying things about the evil and the terror that's going on in the Middle East and all that, And of course, Kyle had already demonstrated he was not defending fake Christianity down through history. He was talking about the church that followed the New Testament, wherever that church is, And so what he tried to do is go back to the crusade and say, look at all the evil committed in the name of Christianity. Well, while that may have been in the name of Christianity, it wasn't Christianity. That was Roman Catholicism. That was carnal warfare. And no spiritual impact at all. And then, so he said, and here's the religion of Muhammad. And here you got Jews, they don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And here you got Muslims who believe there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet, and they don't accept Jesus being the Son of God. And then you got Confucianists, and you got Hindus, and all. And so, according to him, then there can't be any objective standard because you have no consensus of all these people all over the world. Again, about what thing ever has been determined to be true based upon consensus. And if we're going to listen to experts, it's not that many years ago that people realized germ theory as to how people were getting sick. Now, they could have known better because in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, germ theory was taught to the children of Israel, to the restrictions that were placed upon them, up to and including going outside the camp and covering your waist. Now, for some reason, the rest of the world didn't buy into that until the 1800s. What does that mean? Well, people didn't follow God's directions and His guidance through all those years, and millions of people died who didn't have to. That's what happened. Now we understand. What a travesty from a physical standpoint, yeah? But is it any worse? Or is it up to the standard of the travesty of multitude, millions being lost because they don't accept the same guidance that God has given? See? Yes, sir.
One comment while I was running through here. An interesting comment I heard a man that was from an Irish Catholic family. That his mother said that Ireland was full of Catholics and Protestants and not a Christian in the world. She knew this. It was all wrong. It's just too bad that somebody couldn't get to it really and for home in walk on the truth. She understood it. It was
Yeah,
one Christian. Of course, there are. I'm sure there's
sure.
few Christians in Ireland.
Well, I mean, like God told Jeremiah to go to Jerusalem, see if he could find a man. Well, he wasn't talking about finding a male, because there's all kind of males there. But a genuine man that loved truth and would not allow anything else other than that, there was few and far between. So, you know, it's a sad thing. And what Kyle tried to show to him is that all these other religions, because they are man-made, they offer nothing past here. They don't. Christianity is the only thing that says undergo some difficulties here because it'll be worth it in eternity. These other religions are based upon the here and now, and what you can accomplish or fix you up for the present instead of being queued in for the long run to eternity for sure. Well, I didn't mean to get all into but I mean that's just so on the top of my head right now that I just thought we'd talk about that. And it fits in here. Notice on page number, whatever page this is, chapter 15, in the first question, obviously in this little section, the first part of this 15th chapter, it actually goes along with what has been said in chapter 14. And if you'll notice the first words that he uses here in chapter 15, we then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves. All right. So when he says we then, that's sort of like a therefore, which means what's been said at the end of the previous chapter is drawing to a conclusion right here. And he identifies, once again, these two different classifications of brethren. You got strong and you got the weak. And you got a word that is a significant word. It's a word that is translated ought. Ought. We that are strong ought. What does ought mean? Should. It's not ought like Jethro Bodine, you know, triple naught, double naught spire or whatever. No, it's a different one. Here is, we're talking about something that ought to, here's a moral obligation. Well, where do moral obligations come from? In order to have a moral obligation, there has to be a moral standard. Who developed that standard? Well, it had to be God. So here's a divine responsibility that's placed upon the individuals pictured here as being the strong, who ought to do the right thing by the weak brethren. And I would go so far as to say, if there's something that you ought to do and that God says you ought to do it, if you don't do it, then you're guilty of sin. Because if you're ought to do it, then that means you're supposed to do it. Wouldn't that seem to be the indication here? Well, if not, then I'm missing something entirely here. So, and the whole reason why this is, both this previous chapter and right here, is because you've got different types of people and congregations from different backgrounds who believe different things that are different levels of spiritual understanding, or at different levels of emotional stability, or at different levels of all types of things. And yet, there's a way, a divine way, to get through those things in the best possible way. And it just so happens that right here, we're dealing with things that people disagree on that are matters of indifference. Now, we talked a little bit about this on Sunday, of a real live example of it being put into practice. And I've made this observation before, that through the influence of people in the 1800s, some congregations, even to this day, do not offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday evening. Okay? And that's a practice of long standing. The reason why they don't is because they are not convinced that the Lord's Supper should be offered any other time than on the AM service on a Sunday, on the first day of the week. Okay? Now, would you classify that position as being a position of weakness or a position of strength? Well, it's according to who you want to be weak and who you want to be strong. All right? Now, as it relates to what we just got through talking about, and if we leave it in the position of a matter of indifference, we would leave it in the position of where it's all right to either offer the Lord's Supper on Sunday evening, or it's not all right. But either one, it doesn't matter. It's all right to, and it's all right not to. Okay? And that's where we have placed it as far as intercongregational relationships over this issue right here. Now, that's a fact. Fellowship has not been withdrawn over either position. It's not even been an issue for a number of decades, but at one time it was. Okay? And so now it's just common knowledge that if you are a person who wants to take the Lord's Supper on Sunday night, then there's some congregations that you might want to go somewhere else because they don't offer it on Sunday night. And in order to not cause a stink or act like the world's come to an end by pointing out that you don't see how they can be so unable to see the propriety of doing a thing, is not a justification for causing harm on the church just because you think they ought to be at your level presently. Is this the only issue that fits in the category of? Absolutely not. There's hundreds of them. So what do? Try to split the church over these disagreements over matters that we're not sure how to deal with it? Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about matters of indifference. We're not talking about whether we're going to have women preachers or we're going to use instrumental music in worship. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about whether we're going to kick what the Lord said about marriage, divorce, and remarriage in Matthew chapter 19:9. We're going to kick it out the window. We ain't going to follow it no more. And we're not going to treat it as if it's 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and here's a man who's living with his father's wife. That's not what this issue is. It's something else entirely. So let's leave it in the area of a matter that is got a weak brother and a strong brother, or a weak sister and a strong sister that's dealing with a matter. And I dare say there's a whole lot of things that would fit in that category. Well, how's that work in a real life situation? Suppose you got a congregation in which there are some in the congregation who do not believe in the propriety of doing that thing, but they're not going to push it to the point of severing fellowship over an indifferent matter. They simply do not participate in serving or offering the prayers for the Lord's Supper on Sunday evening. Is that all right? Well, it better be. Well, sure it's all right. And how do you justify that? Because of the self-rule of individual congregations. And hopefully the time will come when people see that which was clear, at least to many, at some point in the future, and that'll no longer be a problem. And how many other things fit in that category? Well, yes, sir.
Related to the Lord's Supper issue too, you go to certain congregations,
Yeah.
to be served.
Yeah.
So, you know, is that
And that's another one of those things.
you may have a preference,
Sure.
you know, about that.
Yeah.
And I personally like the way we do it.
Yes, I do too.
The congregation is assembled while we're waiting, you know, for them to pay. But many congregations, very sound congregations, do not do it that way.
No, they don't. And so there again, here's a congregation, and and we have to do this about all kinds of things, realizing congregational autonomy. Why do some congregations have a meeting at the time they have a meeting? It's because they choose to have a meeting at that. Why do they not have Sunday night services an hour later so everybody can come like we? Why? Well, that ain't our business. That's not everybody else's congregation. Every other congregation, that's not their business. They are making decisions in the realm of expediency and those things that are authorized to the best of their ability. Are decisions that are sometimes made by brethren less than adequate? Well, sure. But are decisions made by individual Christians less than adequate? Sometimes, for sure. Do I ever make dumb decisions? Not this century. Oh, of course. So the application of this whole little situation here, of course, is trying to respond in the most beneficial way with causing the least amount of harm over stuff that ultimately don't matter anyhow. That's the thing. If it doesn't amount to a hill of beans, then obviously it's not deserving of losing a whole lot of sleep or causing a great disturbance over. And there again, being able to distinguish between the things that matter and things that don't can only be arrived at by knowing what the Bible actually teaches.
Freddie?
Yes, sir.
Back to the Lord's Supper, there are congregations, I know in McMinnville right now, there are at least two congregations I know of, very sound congregations, that don't even meet on Sunday night at all.
Yeah.
But they meet for Bible class, they meet for worship initially at, say, 9 o'clock, whatever. Then a Bible class at 10, and then another worship at 11.
Yes.
And then they're finished for the day.
Yeah.
There are at least two congregations in McMinnville that are doing that now.
And some of them have been doing that for a while, And of course, I've told this when we first moved up to Smith County, they had just decided through every member got to express their hope, what they wanted, at what time they want to meet on Sunday morning. And so the number at the time, 9 o'clock, was decided on by most people. Well, I just thought when I received that information and the tabulation from the voting on the time to meet, then I thought I better hang on to that. Well, sure enough, about 2 years later, there were people that were griping and complaining about the time. And so I got out my little old sheet, and it was the very ones that had voted to change it that was griping about it. Now, that don't make much sense, does it? I mean, they were instrumental in moving it from a scriptural time, like 9:30, to an unscriptural time, like 9. And then they didn't want to live by it, Said, oh, it's too early, So I was glad I kept it, and I showed it to them. Said, did we really do that? I said, if you can't remember 2 years, then you don't need to be deciding anything, especially like that, for sure. So let's see. And so remember the context again, because I know when you get to verse 4 here, based upon notice, well, let's read verse 2 through 4. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. That sounds like Philippians chapter 2, doesn't it? Think not every man on his own things, but on things of others. Now, that's not thinking on how I can sneak over and steal it. That means you're putting the hopes and the aspirations and the desires of other people before yourself. That don't sound like the way the world works, but that's exactly what Christianity is all about. Looking to please your neighbor before you please yourself, and the end result being edification. And then he uses the example of Jesus. Jesus pleased not himself. Now somebody said, wait a minute, you mean Jesus was responsible for doing things that he didn't want to do? That's not what I said. I said it was not a matter of his own self-preservation that he was motivated by. If it was, he wouldn't have went to the cross. He chose to be crucified on the cross. He gave his life for us. It wasn't taken from him. He gave it. And then based upon that, then this famous verse number 4, for whatsoever things were written aforetime are written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Now somebody says, now wait a minute. When you quote that passage of Scripture, it's not the same context that you got here. Well, notice what Paul has just got done doing. He's just got done quoting from the Old Testament. And then he says, here's the propriety for quoting from the Old Testament. He's talking about the fulfillment of prophecy and that which Christ suffered. And so you can learn. We don't live under the Old Testament law, but we certainly learn from how God dealt with man. And I'm working on a sermon right now because many times people, they want to categorize the God of the Old Testament as being a whole lot different than that good God of the New Testament. It's almost like you got the wicked God of the Old Testament or something, as if there's two different gods. And they don't see all the good things, all the benevolent things, all the specific things that God did, not only to the patriarchs of old, but of course to the children of Israel as well, in making their lives a whole lot better. I mentioned just a few minutes ago, why was it that here you got these people who did not suffer the same diseases as others? Because they had law that God gave so they could avoid some of the diseases that other people would have. Don't you think that's a positive thing? Their physical life was preserved. That sounds pretty good to me. So he's not a God who's waiting behind a tree and seeing somebody do something and jump out and shoot them. That's not the God of the Bible. That's a comic book character that shouldn't exist in anybody's mind in regards to the God who created and sustains this world to this very hour. Number 4, to what degree are we to receive one another? So here we've got a standard. As Christ received us, so we receive others. Now, think about this. Does that mean that in order to be received by the Father, we have to be sinlessly perfect? If it did, then we'd be in a heap of trouble, because we're not. Does it mean we're to have an attitude of being willing to repent anytime we find ourselves walking astray of what God has required for us to do? That could be the case, should be the case. So when it comes to our continued walk in the light, then we're continually dependent upon His blood to free us from sin, the consequences of sin. And of course, that same power the blood of Christ has when we initially obey the gospel. And as we continue to walk in the light as His in the light, the fellowship that we enjoy is due to the fact that the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses us from all sin. Number 5, in his preaching, what did Paul try to avoid? And this is not as obvious as you'd think, but it seems to be, he's talking about here, he doesn't want to, and I don't know why if he doesn't, it's almost like he doesn't want to come in and build on a foundation that somebody else has established. Why? And what is he talking about? Is he talking about building a foundation for a tent? I mean, that's the work that he does, isn't it? I didn't know you put tents on foundations. What is he talking about building here? Is he talking about physically building? Go on. He's talking about building the church. He is leery of building on the foundation of the truth that someone else has laid because he doesn't really know what it was, you know. He doesn't know how in depth it is. And so the idea being, it seems to me, is that if he can begin and he knows where he's beginning, then he knows where he's going once he gets started. But if here's an individual who maybe has been introduced to various aspects of the gospel, and then you come in on top of that, you don't know what they know, and so, of course, you can figure it out pretty quick, for sure. And there has to be the work of individuals who are sowing the seed, and then those who are coming along and watering it. And then ultimately, of course, God will give the increase. Number 6, where did Paul hope to go after he got through it wrong? If he got through it wrong. He wanted to go to Spain, okay? And of course, this again is somewhat conjecture, but Paul saw any area that he was not aware that any Christians lived there. He saw that as an opportunity, where so many times we'd look at that as a place to avoid. Well, that's not the way Paul looked at it. If here's a group of people who haven't been introduced to Jesus, then they need to be introduced to Jesus. There's going to be plenty of people. Any way you turn, right or left, they're going to be staring right at you. And so that's what Paul wants to come about. And then number 7, where was he headed at the time he wrote this epistle and why? He's headed to Jerusalem, and he's taken with him what? Money, financial assistance to relieve the suffering saints in Judea and Jerusalem. And of course, that you can look at Acts chapter 11 and Acts chapter 24, and has more concerning all that. And then, of course, specifically the application in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and 9 as well, all referring to the same contribution. All right, we'll have to stop right there. Now, chapter 16 is, again, we're going to be reminded of a bunch of guys and gals here. I'm thinking one of the questions even is how many different individuals are listed here. Has anybody got that question answered? I added up 28 different people. Wouldn't you like to have been on the receiving end and been mentioned by the Apostle Paul, and here we are reading your name all these years later? Now, the sad thing is it works both ways. If you were a Jew while Nehemiah is rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem, and your family is a bunch of worthless dogs and won't do nothing, then your name's going to be recorded for all history too. And right there you can read it. They would not put their hand to the work. Why did they not? This work is too lowly for us. Well, there's your name recorded for all history as being a family that would not do the work that God had commissioned them to do. So you got the positive and the negative, and of course I hope we'd prefer the positive, for sure. All right, we'll stop right there, start here, chapter 16, Lord willing, on Sunday morning.